So thanks for the kind welcome, Sam. Really appreciate that. You may or may not know who I am. You might have seen me running around with my family, my wife Joellen over there, and my kids. We moved here about 2 years ago to Delaware, and we started coming to DCC pretty quickly as soon as we moved here. And prior to living here in Delaware, I was in the Coast Guard for 20 years, or 20, a little more than that. And that job took me all over the country, all over parts of the world. We lived in different cultures in different cities across the U.S. And I used to be a pilot, used to fly planes for them. And one of the reasons why I am passionate about this topic is because one of the places they sent me was to graduate school at one of the universities here in the Midwest. And through one of the campus ministries there, I had a lot of interaction with some of the smartest people I've ever met, some extremely smart PhD scientist types, physicists, chemists, engineers, that were believers. And they had a particular outlook on this science and faith conflict, or the science and faith combination, however you want to say it. And it really kind of lit a fire of curiosity for me, a little over 10 years ago. And since then, I've really been passionate about this and learning as much as I can. And then one of the things when we moved here actually from Alaska. That was our last station before I got out. And living in Alaska, being immersed in God's creation in a way that it kind of gets you out of your comfort zone, because we were in such extreme weather and just nature all around us. You couldn't help but pique your interest and be like, how is it this way? Why does the wind blow so hard up here? Why are the days so short or so long? What's different and why? And that really piqued my interest, kept me digging in deeper. Now, why are we talking about this stuff? One of the other things I realized when I was at the university environment was that it's really important that we send our kids off with a solid understanding of why they have faith. Because when they go into the university environment or in college, or just out into the culture in general, there's a lot of competing ideas out there. And the odds, quite frankly, aren't very good. A lot of kids go into college with faith, and they do not make it through with their faith intact. And sometimes they regain that later in life, but that's almost a hostile environment in some places, depending on where they are. So that's why it's important, but it's also important because there's a lot of people that I come in contact with who this science and faith is really a barrier for them in their own faith, okay? And being able to work through some of this relationship is really important for them to be able to come to faith or to stay with faith, okay? So that's why. So over the next 3 weeks, we'll be talking about science and nature in depth. And you might say, wait a second here. If you can go to the next slide. We're in church on a Sunday. Why are we talking about science? Are we even supposed to? That sounds a little weird. Is this wrong? Should we even be doing this? Should we even try to learn about God from nature? Isn't that something we should be studying the Bible for? Not looking into nature? That sounds potentially dangerous. So if you move to the next slide, let's look in the Bible and see what the Bible has to say about that. Okay, so we have Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Declare and proclaim from the sky above and the heavens. That's information. It's telling us. The heavens are telling us about God, okay? If you go to the next slide, we've got another verse, Psalm 111. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. I'm somebody who delights in the works of the Lord. I love to study it and understand in the hopes that it brings me a little bit better understanding of God. Let's look at another verse from the New Testament, Romans 1, verse 20. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. Clearly perceived. Okay, so what does that mean? That means, I gotta scoot back a little more here, sorry. It's ringing. Clearly perceived. That means that there is enough information baked into nature and our creation that we can understand God's invisible attributes of power and divine nature. Isn't that neat? Now, I'm not here to worship the earth, the created over the creator, but our goal over these next few weeks is to describe God's creation, our nature, our natural environment, in a way that hopefully, going forward, you can't unsee him in it. All right? That's our goal. We'll see if we can achieve it. So if you move to the next slide, there's a couple of types of revelation here, and this is kind of where that conflict comes in. So general revelation, as you read there up on the top, that's the created universe. It's readily available to all. We all, if we're walking the earth and alive, general revelation is available to us, and that gives us information about God. Revelation about God, about his character, about his existence. And then there's special revelation. That's things like the scriptures, the Bible, or maybe a special revelation like a dream or a vision that you might receive directly. But if both of these revelations originate from God, then there can't really be any conflict in these. Okay? Now, the culture would have you believe that conflict within science and faith, or between science and faith, is just unavoidable. Trying to reconcile these two things is madness. Why would you even try? Can't be done. You're crazy if you try. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. So if you go to the next slide, this is an example of kind of why. The first time I saw this picture, or a similar one, was when I was back in grad school, and it was a Bible study or a Sunday school I was part of at our church, being taught by a PhD physics professor. She's a dynamic, great teacher. And she brought this up first, but this has been discussed for years and years and years among some of the greatest minds in history, like Thomas Aquinas and Francis Bacon. And the idea here is, if God is the source of everything, it's kind of a flow diagram, then nature and Scripture flow out of God. He created both of them. And at that level, between nature and Scripture, there can be no conflict. They both originated from God. That is, at least if you believe God is a God with a character that doesn't deceive, that he tells us the truth, that he's not trying to just trick us for the fun of it. And that's personally what I believe, that he's a God of truth. Now see, if you follow this flow diagram down a little bit, it goes, nature and Scripture go through these filters we'll call humans. And these humans, these are people with free will and their own individual wants and needs and desires. And through those filters, we spit out science and theology, which are the study of nature and the study of Scripture and God. Okay? And that really, shown by those lightning bolts, that's where this conflict lies. Okay? It's the study of this done by us humans, us imperfect humans. Now that's the reason that I show this diagram is because that should give us confidence. I think some people are a little bit nervous sometimes to study science or look into nature, and with fear that they might find something they don't like maybe that's going to undermine their faith in God. But see, if this is true, if you get more understanding of nature, it's going to bring you closer to an understanding of God. You're going to get to bypass some of that, not bypass, but go back the other direction through that flow diagram. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, we're going to dive into some science in a few minutes here, and you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't this guy just say he was a pilot? Why would I listen to some doofus pilot tell me about science? I should have like a physicist or something up here. And I say, that's a fair question. Okay? I did a lot of science as a pilot. I really cared about gravity for obvious reasons. Okay? I also really cared about the weather. So I studied the weather very closely every day, because you don't want to fly through a thunderstorm or a hurricane if you don't absolutely have to. And my job was mostly flying looking for lost people in the ocean. So I learned about the ocean currents and where those people might float when their boat sinks, trying to predict that, understanding that system. And then I started realizing how closely interconnected all of these systems were. Okay, so that's one of the things that forms my worldview on this topic. But I'll tell you what actually forms it more is my experience as an engineer. All right? And I know most of you just went, oh no. They let an engineer up there to talk. Shoot. this is going to be terrible. Engineers are weird. They're killjoys. He's probably going to show some math. He's probably going to show some charts. There might even be a test. And I'm here to tell you, engineers are not that bad, okay? Any engineers in the room? Yep, that's right, yep. And you didn't hear them because engineers are generally introverted, a little bit backward. I know half of them in here, and they just didn't say, they're like, I guess I'm an engineer. Oh, okay, right? So anyway, but I'm here to tell you, I'm a different engineer. I'm a cool engineer. I'm not one of those geeks, all right? And this is proof of it. These are all my buddies from engineering school here. You can see them on the sides. I'm not kidding. This is out of my yearbook. These are my buddies from engineer school. But they are actually pretty normal guys. See, they thought it'd be funny for our class pictures there that they would all wear the stereotypical engineer gear of a faded yellow shirt, a pocket protector with a calculator in it, some terrible ugly glasses, bad haircuts, an ugly tie, and some goofy face. And they thought, hey, that'd be funny, right? I think it was. These are all really relatively normal dudes, all right? So I swear, I'm not one of those geeky, dorky engineers. But engineers have a different viewpoint of the world. They look very closely at design, at purpose. That's why we're sometimes thought of as killjoys, because for maybe the happy-go-lucky types who are like, I just want to do this because it's fun. And we're like, yeah, for what purpose? Like, there's a way more efficient way to do that. And people are like, oh, geez, engineers. But engineers look for purpose. And we also have a hard time, if somebody says something happened with no real purpose in mind, we're like, I have a hard time believing that. Because see, engineers, our job is to build and to create something new. And we have a very good appreciation for how hard that is to do and to have it work. Because if you're going to build something, that thing has to be reliable and repeatable to be useful. It has to stay together and actually work. And that's hard. So when somebody says like, oh, this stuff just came together and all of a sudden it started working together, engineers go, well, I've never seen that happen. That's why, and not only does it come together and start working, but it keeps working. That's hard to believe. That's why you always have to have software updates on your computer or your phone. You always have to do maintenance on your car. It's continually falling apart. Your house is falling apart. That's because getting stuff to continually work as an integrated, synchronized system is very difficult. So that's kind of creates my perspective on this. So let's talk a little bit about science real quick. If you pull up the next slide, this is a definition from Google. It's a pretty basic definition. I think it's a decent one. There's a bunch of definitions out there, but the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical natural world through observation, experimentation, and testing of theories against evidence obtained. Okay. I want you to key in on a couple of the words on there. Systematic study, structure, and behavior. Structure, that means there's order to it. Behavior, that means it does certain things. That means you can predict that it's going to do those certain things in the future. That nature has structure and a certain behavior that can be studied and can be learned. That is something that is indicative of design. And when I say design, that also implies a designer. Now, engineers are scientists. The first step of creating or designing a thing is to understand the environment in which it is going to operate, right? So we do science to understand how we need to build something. And then we have to do a lot of science to figure out what kind of energy are we going to use to make that thing do something. We need to learn all about that and the materials. Those materials are coming from nature. We need to understand what those materials are. There's a lot of science that goes into engineering, okay? So when your job is to create, you have this real appreciation for how hard it is. Also, the more complex it is, the more fragile it generally becomes. Now, we're going to discuss a bunch of these topics. They're going to span a whole bunch of scientific disciplines, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in any or all of them. I'm going to take more of a systems engineering approach and say, here's kind of how this thing works, but here's how this thing that's really complex combines with this thing that's really complex, combines with this thing that's really complex to create a purpose or to serve a purpose, okay? And I'm going to overgeneralize and oversimplify some of this stuff. And if you're an expert in any of these fields, you're going to sit there and you may cringe and think like, oh, that wasn't quite right, or it's 10 times more complicated than that. He didn't do it justice. And I'll be like, yes, you're right, I didn't. Because if you come and say, well, it's way more complicated than that, I'll say, oh, well, does that indicate a higher potential for design or not? And I'm confident that that's what we're going to find. So this is where we start talking about design. So if you can go to the next slide. Ha, I tricked you. I am a big geek, and we're going to talk about charts. Look at this. I told you I was cool. I'm not. I'm a big geek. I'm an engineer geek. I even have a laser pointer. Look at that. All right. So this is just to describe a relationship. This is how I view the world through XY plots. Who loves that? Yay! No? Am I alone in that? Maybe me and 4 other people? All right, so this is just to describe a relationship, how much I like or hate work based upon how nice the weather is outside. So on the bottom axis, it goes rainy to sunny, and this is torture up to, okay, I'll do it. All right, so on the rainy day, well, I'll tolerate it. I'll do work. But on the sunny day, I do not want to be inside. I want to be out in God's creation doing something fun, worshiping Him. I got a similar slide. If you can move to the next one. Shows relationships. This relationship is how much I like ice cream versus how many toppings are on that ice cream. Okay, on a scale of vanilla to fudge sundae with nuts on it. And you can see here at the bottom, I'm just kind of like, the vanilla sundae, or the vanilla ice cream, I'm like, meh, I can take it or leave it. But as you add toppings, my happiness level goes up with that amount of toppings on the ice cream. Does that make sense? It's sloping upward. Okay, now these were just primers for the next chart. That's the one that really matters. So if you can go to the next chart. This is a chart that shows a similar relationship of the probability that nature is designed for a purpose, here on the left side, versus the complexity we see in nature. From the scale of 0 being nothing at the start to, well, maybe a rock. It's just a rock. It just sits there, does nothing, doesn't interact. It's just a rock. All the way up in complexity, building, all the way up to something as complex as the human eye that's part of a human that interacts with the world and other humans for a relationship. And this chart kind of represents 2 viewpoints. One is that the world started in chance. It was just a random happening. Up here at the top, where you see, and that chance is represented here by the dice, up to design. This is intricately designed, synchronized gears meshing together to perform a purpose or a function, okay? Now, you guys are used to seeing Sam up here, and I know I'm not Sam, but we do have some similarities that might not be as obvious. Sam and I are roughly the same age, roughly the same height. We both have sweet haircuts. We both have a beard. And Sam's, you guys know Sam has an accent. He came here from Brazil. English is not his first language, so he has that accent. And you might not know, English is also not my first language. My first language is sarcasm, okay? And my accent comes out all the time. Ask my family. But if you're not fluent in sarcasm, I'm going to walk you through this. See, every time, if you can go back one slide real quick. Every time I describe a really intricate, really connected, really finely tuned, multi-level system that is interdependent on each other, I'm going to say, wow, what a neat little coincidence. That's sarcasm. I don't really believe it's a coincidence. I believe it's part of a tightly coupled, meshed system made for a purpose, okay? So, I should probably tell you a little bit about just in general my view on creation. I think God created in a few different ways. One is immediate and complete acts of creation, and one is instilling a process that maybe takes place over time, and he guides that over some period of time to accomplish some purpose. In Genesis, he did creation over 6 days, over a period of time. That's biblical. But also we see that he did creation sometimes in immediate, miraculous acts. All right, so I think there's a little bit of both. He's got both of those tools in the belt. And I think he also works that way in our spiritual lives as well. Sometimes, like Saul on the road to Damascus, you have immediate, transformative things that happen, complete transformation. And then sometimes, spiritually, you'll get these just gentle spiritual nudges, maybe over a period of 20 or 40 or 50 years that brings you from unbelief to belief. So I think he kind of works in the spiritual world, or the physical world, similarly to how he works in the spiritual world. That's just my own perspective. But I think this is kind of like building a house. When you build a house, you start with the foundation, then you put up the walls, then you put in the water and the plumbing, then you put in the electrics so you can have lighting and heat, and then you put in the heating and the air conditioning, and then you put in the dishwasher and the sink, and then you paint it and make it look pretty on side, and then finally you put the family in it. And I think that's kind of how God created our existence, okay? So we're about to get started talking about some of this scientific stuff. That's enough about me and my background and why I think like this. And what better place to get started than at the beginning? So we'll talk about the first page, Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. That's the first couple sentences in the Bible. And it says, formless and void. It doesn't say it was like an amoeba, it was kind of like a big thing of Play-Doh. It says formless and void, empty. There was nothing. And then God said, let there be light. And then there was something. Okay? Nothing to something. Now, this is actually somewhere, Sam hit on this last week a little bit. This is somewhere where science and religion actually agree. Back when we first wrote Genesis, since then, people have been believing, well, the universe had a beginning. It went from nothing to something. But that was not the prevailing assumption in science up until about 100 years ago. Science used to believe that the universe was eternal, it had always existed, it will continue to always exist, and there was no need for a creator. And then it got uncomfortable because they started realizing, it looks like there was a beginning to this. And all the believers were like, yeah, we told you that, right? Thanks for coming to our side. Now, there's wild disagreement on how long it took. We're not going to get into that. That's like a 3 to 5 week discussion just in itself. We're not going to talk about that. But we will say that there's a difference in reason between or cause for that initial event. The believer is going to say, well, I think that God was the cause of that. That was a miraculous event. And the naturalist, science-minded person is going to say, well, that was a spontaneous statistical anomaly where matter and energy just burst out of nothing somehow and then formed itself into all that we see around us today in a very ordered and organized way. So if we're going to go from a bunch of matter and energy scattered around the universe to ordered and organized systems like galaxies and stars and planets, there's a quick video I want to show that kind of visualizes how that might go, okay? So if you can go to this next slide, this is just a video showing kind of how gravity works. This pulls together things that have matter, that has mass, and this guy is just showing, the science teacher, is just kind of showing how as it collects in the middle, it collects more and more, and the closer they get, the faster they get sucked in there. And eventually, what seemed like chaos
we want to play, Mr. Burns.
gets put into order. And they do this very similar every time over. Okay? Just a little visualization. It's incomplete. It's not fully accurate for like a whole host of reasons. But it's a little visualization of how matter scattered about can collect itself in a very ordered way. Gravity is the driving force there. Explains gravity. So the more mass it has, the bigger the attractive force, or the larger the attractive force, and also it varies with distance. So the farther away you are from some big mass, like if this is the sun, the farther I get away from it, the lower the force of gravity that you get with it. And the closer you get to it, the harder you get sucked into there. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so how does gravity form all of this stuff? This is a picture of our galaxy. This is, I'll get out of the way here to the right. This is a picture of the Milky Way galaxy. This Milky Way galaxy has our sun in it right down here near the bottom. We're on one of these spiral arms. This looks like order to me. Anybody else? There's what we think is about 100 billion stars like ours that make up just this one galaxy, which we think is one of about 100 billion, maybe to 2 trillion other galaxies that are out there. The deeper we look, the more that we find. But we find order, and we find repetitiveness, and we find complexity. Okay? What a neat little coincidence that that entire giant galaxy forms itself in that way. So let's take a look. We got our sun here in the bottom. Let's take a little bit closer to home. Look at our sun. This is a diagram of the sun. Now, we talked about gravity a little bit ago. I want you to think about pressure, okay? So when gravity brings a bunch of matter together, the matter on the outside is still squeezing the matter on the inside, okay? You feel this if you go to the bottom of the pool. When you go to the bottom of the pool, you might remember your ears are starting to press in, it'll start to hurt, and that's because the mass of the water above you is pressing down on you, trying to squeeze you towards the center of the earth, and that you feel that in your ears. Well, when you increase pressure, you also increase temperature, and that's why, like, the inside of the earth is hot with molten lava, and that's why the inside of the sun, because it's huge, it's way bigger than the earth, it's way, way, way bigger. It's so hot inside the sun that creates what's called nuclear fusion. And this nuclear fusion process that we think is what's going on in the inside of the sun releases a huge amount of energy. It's a nuclear reaction, and releases a huge amount of energy in the form of heat and light that we get to benefit from here on Earth. But it's also cyclical. See, the hot stuff in the middle flows out towards the outside where it cools, and then eventually it gets sucked back into the middle, and it's cyclical over and over. If you ask a scientist, how long is this process going to go? They're going to tell you roughly 5 billion more years. That there's stages of stars that go for billions and billions of years, and we observe those out there in those other billions of stars that are out there, so you get to see all the stages of them. And they think that our sun happens to be in its most stable stage of its lifespan, which is going to give us another 5 billion years of stable energy production. Repeatable, reliable, systematic. What a neat little coincidence. All right, so let's go to the next slide. We got the sun, okay, we just talked about that. That gives us heat and light. And we orbit around the sun, okay? So this orbit, this is not just random motion, okay? This orbit is a balance of two different forces. It's a balance of momentum and gravitational force. What does that mean? So that means if this is the sun, this table, and something is moving past it, it's going to be sucked into the sun, or sucked towards the sun by the gravitational pull here. But if it has enough velocity going this way, and that's equal to the force of gravity pulling it in, it will bend it around in a perfect circle, or close, in what's called an orbit, okay? Repeatable, cyclical. Our orbit around the sun that you see up there with all these other planets that are in our solar system, our orbit around the sun takes 365 days. It doesn't take sometimes 300 days and sometimes 600 days. It's repeatable, it's reliable, it's systematic. And this is only one part of the, the mystery, or not mystery, but the complex system of our solar system here. It's called a solar system. That's because it's repeatable. They're interconnected, okay? What a neat little coincidence. So then let's move to the next slide. And this slide, I know some of you don't think about this. I think to myself after or before I pray at a meal, I'm like, thank you, Lord, for the tilt of the earth. Do you need to do that? No? Am I the only one? So the Earth is tilted on its axis, 23.5 degrees here. What that means is that when you're on one side, I've got a little stage stuff to help me demonstrate this. This is the sun. You can see all the fusion going on in the middle. All right, that's going to be here. This is the Earth with the northern hemisphere on top right here, and it's spinning continuously like this. Now, it has a 23.5 degree tilt of its axis, so that means when I'm on this side of the orbit, more of the northern hemisphere is getting more sun than the southern hemisphere, okay? This is how our seasons come about, because the Earth is continually heating the North Pole here. At the North Pole, the sun doesn't go down for a long time, for like months. But at the South Pole, it's extremely cold because it's in the shade the whole time, okay? And as you move to the other side, go about 182 days this direction, to the other side of the orbit, now the southern hemisphere is in the sun, and the northern hemisphere is in the shade, and it gets very cold up here on top. Okay, so it's cold on top and warm in the middle. What does that do? Why do we care? So what? Well, that is like the engine that drives our winds and drives our climate. If you don't have that temperature difference between the equator and the top of the Earth and the bottom of the Earth, we get stagnant, non-motion air, okay? And that air has a whole bunch of purposes, and that's why it moves around quite a bit, okay? So the tilt of the Earth gives us our seasons, gives us the motion of the winds to move water and oxygen around the Earth. What a neat little coincidence. Now, this is a video, if you bring up this next one. This kind of shows what I was talking about. This is the northern hemisphere. So you're seeing the sun shining on this side. This is in the summertime, but look, the North Pole the sun never goes down. The farther you get to the north, it's always in the sun. And that means that it gets more time to be heated every day. Now, most of us think like, well, up north, it's colder, right? Up in northern Alaska and Canada. That's not actually necessarily true. Inland in northern Canada and Alaska, they get sometimes 40 days of straight sunshine, or straight the sun being up. The sun doesn't go down for like 40 days in the summer there. So it actually gets kind of warm. And that temperature difference between there and the southern hemisphere is what drives a lot of our weather. Now, there's another neat little coincidence that you'll see in here. Look at that. That's another orbit. That's the moon. In orbit around the sun, balanced forces, momentum, and gravity. Why is the moon there? Well, there's a few different reasons, but one thing is if you have a tilted axis like we do, and you're in an orbit around the sun, you would need something to stabilize it to keep that axis from wobbling back and forth while it's spinning. And that is what the moon does. It keeps that axis stable through its gravitational force and motion around the Earth. To keep that going repeatably, reliably, day in, day out, numbering our days and marking our seasons. So if you go to the next slide, what you're going to see here, this is a diagram of our winds that I was just talking about. So here at the equator, you get a lot more warm air because you always, pretty much all year long, have sun for about the same amount of time. It gets nice and warm here at the equator. And then because hot usually moves towards cold, that creates motion. All the air wants to go up towards the poles where it's cold. So the air wants to go from the equator to the poles. And we'd say, well, that sounds weird because normally our weather comes out of the west here, not out of the south. So what happens? Well, there's this weird force called Coriolis effect, and that's due to the rotation of the Earth plus the motion of the air that wants to go towards the poles from the equator. And because the Earth has a different circumference here, well, the circumference is the same, but because at the equator, if you were standing on the equator, you're moving really fast around the circumference of the Earth. But if you stand on the North Pole, you're actually just spinning slowly, one spin for 24 hours. You're not actually moving at all if you're right on the North Pole. And because of that, that means that as stuff moves from here to here, it changes its velocity this direction and causes it to curve, which is why when you look at hurricanes and our weather patterns, they're all curved. And they create these They actually interact together. They create these 3 different sections that are split by about 30 degrees of latitude. And each of these different sections of air has a different characteristic with it. They all interact together, and they don't only interact along the surface, they also interact in a very complex system that moves up in altitude as well. Up in altitude, they combine and they create what's called the jet stream, which is this purple thing. And then there's another jet stream down here. It's a little bit weaker because the temperature difference is less. And that can be like sometimes 150, 170 mile an hour winds up around 30 to 40, 50,000 feet. Moving oxygen, moving water vapor, moving our forgot the word, atmosphere around, mixing it, making sure we don't have any dead spots, right? What a neat little coincidence. And then we move to the next slide. See, the Earth is stratified into kind of 3 sections. The dense matter, the stuff that's the heaviest and the hardest, moves to the bottom. And then we have liquid, so that's the solids at the bottom in the middle of the Earth. And then we have liquid that's a little bit less dense, water that sits on top of that and kind of floats on top of that. And then we have the gaseous air floating above that. Well, this is how the water works, where it collects. And the water has the same thing. The water gets warmed here near the equator, and it's cold up here near the poles, and it wants to flow from the equator north. But because of that same effect called Coriolis, it creates this turning motion, and which creates these swirls. And those swirls are constantly mixing all the nutrients, all the oxygen, bringing new life, regenerating. What's making life more probable here in these oceans, all these ocean currents. Very complex, very interconnected with the weather, with the air, with the wind, okay? If you've ever wondered why, if you go to the beach, maybe in the Outer Banks, like North Carolina right here in the summer, you can just jump in with board shorts, no t-shirt, it's fairly warm weather, or warm water. But if you go to California at about the same latitude, it's like everybody's got on wetsuits to go surfing because the water's pretty cold, even though it's the same latitude. Well, this is why. The water here in the Atlantic rotates like this in a clockwise direction. The water is coming up from the south, so it's nice and warm on this side of our country. But over here, the water is still rotating in the same direction here north of the equator, but the water in California is actually coming from the Alaska coast where it's nice and cold. So that's why you got to wear different gear when you go swimming in California. What a neat little coincidence. Repeatable, reliable, cyclical, systematic complexity, okay? So if you go to the next slide, this is about all we have for today. We got 2 more weeks of this plus a Q&A session. And our goal here, I think, hopefully I've moved you to about here on that line, okay? In the next few weeks, we're going to talk about much more complex, much more fun stuff, like water, like animals, like plants, like the human body and how it works. But our goal is to move up this slope, up and to the right, and hopefully, if we do it right, you won't be able to unsee it. You'll be able to see God in all of these things, okay?